Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here for a reading of Cathedral, written by Raymond Carver. This video starts with an original summary and analysis of the story created by me to be in line with YouTube's reuse content policy on videos, so I'm calling out the timestamp for the audiobook itself. The audiobook for the short story Cathedral, written by Raymond Carver, starts at the timestamp 35 minutes and 40 seconds. Again, the audiobook reading with an original performance of the reading done by me begins at 35 minutes and 40 seconds. You can also use the YouTube chapter navigation embedded in the video and in the description below. So in this way, the length of my original summary and analysis matches or exceeds the length of the reading, thereby adding the significant commentary alongside the educational value of giving an original performance of the reading by me as well. There will be one more point of analysis following the reading of the audiobook as well. If this video helped you, or if you enjoyed it, please like it and subscribe to my channel. It helps me to be able to keep supporting you all. If you have any requests for short stories, or poetry, or summaries and analyses, please let me know in the comments. And just dropping a comment to say thanks or hi also greatly helps me out. Feel free to ask me any questions related to your homework that you think I can help with. Stay lit with Simply Lit. So let's start with our summary of Cathedral, written by Raymond Carver. So Raymond Carver's Cathedral is a first-person narrative that explores themes of isolation, transformation, and human connection. The story follows an unnamed narrator who initially harbors deep-seated prejudices against a blind man, Robert, his wife's close friend. Over the course of a single evening, the narrator undergoes a subtle but profound change, culminating in an intimate and revelatory experience. The story begins with the narrator expressing his unease about Robert's visit. His wife has maintained a long-standing friendship with Robert, whom she first met when she worked for him as a reader. They have kept in touch through exchanging recorded tapes, a form of communication that the narrator finds strange and slightly threatening to his sense of self. His dismissive attitude is evident from the outset. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to, he says. The narrator admits his lack of understanding about blind people, stating that his only reference point is how they are portrayed in movies. Quote, "My idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed." His ignorance is coupled with a sense of jealousy over his wife's deep emotional connection with Robert. He recalls how, after working for Robert one summer, she let him touch her face to see what she looked like. This memory, later captured in a poem, irritates the narrator. She showed me the poem. In the poem, she talked about what she felt at the time, about what went through her mind when the blind man touched her nose and lips. I can remember I didn't think much of the poem. Quote, his indifference to the poem underscores his emotional detachment, not just from Robert, but from his wife as well. He cannot comprehend why his wife values this relationship so much, nor does he make an effort to understand. When Robert does arrive, the narrator's discomfort remains palpable, a very present feeling. It's making the vibes off. He is surprised by Robert's appearance and behavior, realizing that his preconceived notions of blind people do not match reality. Quote, "This blind man, feature this, he was wearing a full beard. A beard on a blind man. Too much, I say." The narrator's exaggerated reaction to trivial details like Robert having a beard reveals his inability to see Robert as a person beyond his blindness. He is also startled that Robert does not use a cane or wear dark glasses, contradicting his expectations. During dinner, the narrator remains mostly silent, feeling excluded as Robert and his wife engage in animated conversation about the past. Quote, "They talked of things that had happened to them, these past 10 years. The explanation in his thoughts reveals his underlying resentment. He views their closeness as something that exists apart from him, reinforcing his sense of detachment and jealousy." After dinner, the three continue drinking. Robert smokes cigarettes and, to the narrator's surprise, agrees to try marijuana. This moment marks a turning point as it subtly breaks down the narrator's perception of Robert as someone vastly different from himself. As they drink and smoke, the conversation lulls. The narrator, unsure of what else to do, turns on the television. A documentary about cathedrals comes on, catching Robert's interest. Robert, unable to see the images, asks the narrator to describe what he is watching. Quote, "I stared hard at the shot of the cathedral on the TV. How could I even begin to describe it? But say my life depended on it." Here, the narrator's struggle to describe the cathedral reflects his broader struggle with communication and connection. His initial attempt is vague and uninspired. "They're massive," I said. "They're built of stone, marble too, sometimes. In those olden days, when they built cathedrals, men wanted to be close to God," he says. While technically accurate, his words lack depth or emotional resonance. He is merely reciting facts without truly engaging with their meaning. Recognizing the narrator's difficulty, Robert proposes an alternative approach. "Maybe you could describe one to me. I wish you'd do it. I'd like that." When the narrator continues to struggle, Robert suggests they draw one together. "Do me a favor. Draw me a cathedral." At first, the narrator is hesitant, but he complies. Robert places his hand over the narrator's, guiding him as he draws. His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. It was like nothing else in my life up to now. This moment marks a dramatic shift. The narrator, for the first time in the story, engages in an act of creation, an act that is not cynical, detached, or self-centered, not an act that's all about himself. It's about somebody else this time. As he continues drawing, something within him changes. Robert then gives him an unexpected instruction. "Close your eyes now." Though initially hesitant, the narrator obeys, drawing with his eyes closed. In doing so, he momentarily enters Robert's world, not one of darkness, but one of profound perception beyond sight. The narrator realizes that blindness does not necessarily equate to a lack of understanding. Rather, Robert sees in a way that the narrator himself has not been able to. "There's really something," the narrator says. The simplicity of these words carries immense weight. The narrator, who spent the entire evening detached and judgmental, now finds himself deeply moved. The story ends ambiguously from there, but there is a clear shift in the narrator's perspective. His final moment, drawing with his eyes closed, suggests an awakening, an expansion of his previously narrow world. The act of drawing with Robert has provided him with a new kind of vision, one that transcends physical sight, and one that transcends superficial assumptions and biases. Throughout Cathedral, Carver explores the limitations of perception, both literal and metaphorical. The narrator begins as someone who cannot see beyond his own prejudices, but through his unexpected connection with Robert, he experiences a moment of profound realization. Though we do not know what happens beyond this evening, the final line suggests that, for the first time, the narrator is truly seeing something. And that is our summary of Raymond Carver's Cathedral. Now that we've gone through the summary, let's go forward with different components of analysis, looking at the story from many different angles to help you understand it further. So one of my favorite places to start with analyzing stories and literature is the idea of place and setting, and how place acts as a character itself in stories. So let's talk about place as character in Raymond Carver's Cathedral. In Cathedral, place functions more than just a setting. It acts as an extension of the narrator's psychological and emotional state. The spaces in the story, particularly the narrator's home, are not just locations where events unfold, they actively contribute to the themes of isolation, perception, and transformation. Carver's minimalist style, with its focus on the ordinary and domestic, heightens the symbolic resonance of place. As the story progresses, the home, initially confined and uninspiring, becomes the site of an unexpected revelation, mirroring the narrator's evolving consciousness. So at the beginning of Cathedral, the narrator's home is depicted as a space of routine boredom and emotional detachment. The narrator himself is disconnected from his wife and indifferent to her emotional world, an attitude that's reflected in how he interacts with his physical environment. His living room, where much of the story unfolds, is a space of passive consumption. He watches television, drinks, and smokes, but does not engage in meaningful conversation or experiences. Carver emphasizes this detachment early in the story when the narrator admits, quote, "We lived in a house that had a living room, a kitchen, a hallway, a bath, and 2 bedrooms. At that moment, one of the bedrooms, the one my wife slept in, was being used as a storage room." This detail is significant. The fact that the wife's bedroom has been converted into a storage space suggests both physical and emotional disconnection in the marriage. The home is not a place of warmth or intimacy, but one of separation and neglect. The narrator and his wife occupy the same house, the same space, but they do not truly share a life. The living room, where much of the story's action takes place, is also a reflection of the narrator's emotional limitations. It is filled with mundane objects, ashtrays, drink, and a television that reinforce his passive existence. When Robert arrives, the narrator does not know how to engage with him and defaults to watching television, an activity that requires no effort or emotional investment or cerebral investment. His house, like his mind, is small, confining, and devoid of meaningful connection. The turning point in the story occurs when Robert and the narrator attempt to conceptualize a cathedral, yet another space in this story. The narrator, who has spent the evening physically present but emotionally absent, struggles to describe the image on the television screen. Quote, "I stared hard at the shot of the cathedral on the TV. How could I even begin to describe it? But say my life depended on it." This moment highlights the limitations of perception. He can see the cathedral, but he cannot truly see it in a meaningful way. His struggle to describe the cathedral mirrors his inability to engage deeply with the world around him. Robert's suggestion that they draw the cathedral together transforms the narrator's home from a space of passivity into one of active engagement. As they begin to draw, the space itself seems to shift. The narrator, for the first time, participates in something beyond himself. Quote, "His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. It was like nothing else in my life up to now." At this moment, the living room, previously a state of isolation, a site of isolation, becomes a shared, almost sacred space. The act of drawing allows the narrator to transcend the physical limitations of his environment and experience something beyond his usual way of being. The cathedral, which is not physically present, becomes a symbolic presence and space in the room, turning it into a place of connection and transformation. So, Carver's fiction is often described as, quote, dirty realism, a term associated with his ability to depict the lives of working-class Americans in unembellished prose. Scholars have noted that in Carver's work, place often serves as an externalization of character psychology. In Cathedral, the narrator's home is not just a backdrop, but a reflection of his emotional and intellectual stagnation. So in terms of literary scholars talking about this idea of place and space in stories like Cathedral and Cathedral specifically, literary scholar Kirk Nesset in the Stories of Raymond Carver Critical Study argues that the domestic spaces in Carver's work frequently highlight characters' limitations. He writes, quote, "Carver's characters are often trapped in spaces that mirror their emotional constraints. Small apartments, drab living rooms, kitchens filled with the remnants of routine. These spaces do not simply contain the characters, they define them." The narrator's home fits this description perfectly that Cassett presents us. It's an ordinary, uninspired place mirroring his dull existence, yet, by the end of the story, the same space is redefined through the narrator's experiences with Robert. The act of drawing the cathedral alters the narrator's perception of both space and self, suggesting that transformation is possible even in the most mundane settings. Similarly, critic Arthur M. Saltzman, in Understanding Raymond Carver emphasizes how Carver uses space to reflect shifts in awareness. Quote, "In Cathedral, the narrator's home is initially confined in limiting space, reflecting his self-imposed emotional blindness. Yet, as he engages with Robert, the space opens up not physically, but symbolically, as the narrator begins to see beyond himself. This idea is crucial to understanding the ending of the story. Though the narrator remains in the same room, his experience of that space has changed. His final lines, 'It's really something,' suggest that, for the first time, he perceives the world differently. The living room is no longer just a place where he passively consumes television. It has become a space of imagination and connection." So, therefore, in Cathedral, place functions as a character in its own right, shaping and reflecting the narrator's emotional state. At the beginning of the story, his home is a space of isolation, symbolizing his lack of connection with his wife and the world around him. However, as the story progresses, the space shifts, first into a site of tension with Robert, and then into an unexpected place of transformation. The climax of the story, in which the narrator draws the cathedral, underscores the idea that place is not static. It is defined by perception and experience. The act of drawing and the imaginative space it creates allows the narrator to momentarily break free from his own limitations. Though his home remains the same physically, it is fundamentally altered by the end of the story. It has its own sort of little character arc. By using place in this way, Carver reinforces one of the central themes of Cathedral: the idea that true vision is not about what one sees, but about how one understands and engages with the world and space. Through this transformation of space, from a place of passivity to one of connection, Carver suggests that even the most ordinary places can become sites of revelation and change. Now that we've talked about place as character, let's talk about the actual characters themselves and analyze those characters, as it's another great place to continue to analyze this story. So Raymond Carver's Cathedral is a very masterful study of character, particularly in the development of its unnamed narrator, who we've been talking about. So the story, again, revolves around his interactions with Robert, the blind man, and how their brief but profound exchange transform him. Again, Carver uses this minimalistic yet deeply evocative prose to explore themes of isolation, jealousy, perception, human connection. So, as we go forward, let's analyze our three central characters in this piece, in the short story: the narrator, who's unnamed again, Robert, and the narrator's wife. So, starting with the narrator himself, who, right, is very representative of themes of isolation and transformation, this unnamed narrator serves as the focal point of Cathedral, and his journey from ignorance and detachment to a moment of emotional and perceptual awakening is the story's central arc. And this is because from the outset, the narrator reveals himself to be an emotionally stunted and prejudiced man who holds a bunch of biases and assumptions about, well, in this case, a marginalized community of disabled people and blind people, with the implication that perhaps it extends to other kinds of people, right? So, with this in mind, in his perception of Robert, he thinks to himself, "A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to." His discomfort stems not just from Robert's blindness, but from the intimate relationship Robert shares with his wife, the narrator's wife, right? They have this closeness between them that the narrator and his wife no longer seem to share, and so the narrator harbors jealousy and resentment, particularly regarding their deep emotional bond, which contrasts with the narrator's lack of connection with his wife. His inability to appreciate their friendship is evident in his dismissive attitude towards the tapes they exchange. Quote, "She told me a little bit about the blind man's wife. Her name was Beulah." Beulah, that's a name for a colored woman. His casual racism and insensitivity highlight his emotional immaturity. He makes assumption about Robert's life based on his blindness, stereotyping him as someone to be pitied. His only understanding of blind people comes from popular culture. Quote, "My idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed." Carver presents a narrator as someone who's not engaged meaningfully with the world around him. He drinks heavily, smokes a bunch of weed, and spends most of the time passively consuming television. His home, a dull and uninspired space, mirrors his stagnant existence. So the narrator's transmission begins subtly, first through his growing curiosity about Robert, and then through the act of drawing a cathedral together. When Robert asks the narrator to describe a cathedral, he struggles. Quote, "I stared hard at the shot of the cathedral on the TV. How could I even begin to describe it, but say my life depended on it?" This moment is crucial. It marks the first time the narrator truly attempts to articulate something beyond himself. His inability to do so reflects his limited worldview. When Robert suggests they draw one together, the narrator agrees, and something unexpected happens. Quote, "His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. It was like nothing else in my life up to now." This is the narrator's first genuine moment of human connection in the story. The act of drawing, with Robert guiding his hand, breaks down his prejudices. In closing his eyes, he enters Robert's world, experiencing perception in a new way. Quote, "My eyes were still closed. I was in my house. I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything." This final revelation suggests that, for the first time, the narrator is seeing beyond the physical. He has experienced a moment of transcendence. Now, let's talk about Robert, who is the catalyst for change in our story. So let's analyze his character. Robert, the blind man, is the most emotionally perceptive and open character in the story. Though the narrator initially views Robert as a figure to be pitied, he gradually realizes that Robert has a depth of experience and emotional intelligence that he himself lacks. From the moment Robert arrives, he defies the narrator's expectations. He is relaxed, engaged, and comfortable in social situations. Quote, "This blind man, feature this. He was wearing a full beard. A beard on a blind man. Too much, I say." The narrator's shock at trivial details, Robert's beard, his ability to eat and drink without trouble, underscores his ignorance. Yet Robert is patient and non-judgmental, engaging the narrator in conversation and even partaking in a marijuana cigarette with him, a joint, right? Which surprises the narrator. Quote, "I didn't know what else to say. Then I said, 'Are you ready to hit the sack?'" Rather than being awkward, Robert is warm, insightful, and curious about life. His openness forces the narrator to confront his own limitations. Robert's most significant role is in guiding the narrator's transformation. The drawing exercise is symbolic. Robert helps the narrator see in a new way, not through sight, but through experience. Unlike the narrator, Robert is not confined by physical limitations. He understands the world through touch, sound, and emotion, which he ultimately helps the narrator access. Now that we've talked about Robert and the narrator, let's talk about the narrator's wife, who's a bit of a bridge between this idea of isolation and connection. The narrator's wife, though not essential to the story's action, plays a key role in illuminating the narrator's emotional shortcomings. She is the only character who actively seeks connection. She writes poetry, she maintains deep friendship, she longs for meaningful communication. Her relationship with Robert contrasts starkly with her relationship with her husband, the narrator. She and Robert have exchanged tapes for years, sharing personal thoughts and emotions. In contrast, the narrator admits, quote, "I don't believe in anything. Sometimes it's hard. You know what I'm saying?" His inability to engage emotionally with his wife is central to his alienation. Though she tries to include him in her world, he remains detached, uninterested in her poetry, and dismissive of her emotions. However, by the end of the story, the narrator's experience with Robert suggests that he may begin to bridge this emotional gap that he has with his wife. So let's talk about some scholarly perspectives on characterization in Cathedral. So going back to Kirk Nesset, in Stories of Raymond Carver, a critical study, Nesset argues that Carver's characters are often defined by their limitations, particularly their inability to communicate. He states, quote, Carver's narrators are frequently trapped within themselves, their voices marked by detachment and cynicism. Yet, within these constraints, moments of grace occasionally emerge. The narrator of Cathedral exemplifies this trajectory, this analysis. He begins as an isolated, emotionally numb character, but by the end, he experiences a moment of connection that potentially can grow into something more than that. In Understanding Raymond Carver, Arthur M. Saltzman suggests that Cathedral is fundamentally a story about perception. He writes, the narrator of Cathedral is not physically blind, yet he is spiritually and emotionally sightless. His journey towards awareness is not about seeing in the literal sense, but about recognizing meaning beyond his immediate understanding. This analysis reinforces the idea that Robert, though blind, has greater vision than the narrator, and his role is to help the narrator see in a deeper way. Let's hear what Raymond Carver himself has to say about his character. Carver himself often spoke about his characters as being deeply flawed, but still capable of transformation. In an interview, he said, quote, I want characters who can change, even if that change is small, even if it's just a glimmer of something new. This philosophy is evident in Cathedral. While the narrator does not undergo a grand epiphany, he experiences a moment of openness that suggests the possibility of change. So the character development in Cathedral is subtle but powerful, right? There's no big grand epiphanies like we said, but there is clear, subtle, and powerful transformation occurring. The narrator, initially blind to his own limitations, undergoes a moment of transformation through his encounter with Robert. Though he remains unnamed, his journey is universal, a movement from ignorance to awareness, from isolation to connection. By the end of the story, we don't know if the narrator's change will last, but Carver leaves us with the possibility that, for the first time, he has glimpsed something beyond himself, and as he says in the final lines, the narrator that is, he says, it's really something. So, now that we talked about place and analyze that, character and analyze that, let's talk about the different themes and analyze those in Carver's Cathedrals. So, we talked about some of the key themes that are coming up in Cathedral are this idea of transformation, perception, human connection. And again, Carver's using this minimalist but very evocative style to craft a narrative that really delves into the themes of blindness, both physical and metaphorical, isolation, communication, and spiritual awakening. Right? Spiritual awakening in the sense of knowing oneself anyway. So these themes are conveyed primarily through the evolution of the unnamed narrator, whose emotional detachment and ignorance are gradually replaced with a newfound sense of openness and understanding. So let's talk about blindness both as a literal and metaphorical element of the story in terms of a theme. One of the most prominent themes in Cathedral is blindness, both as a physical condition and as a metaphor for the narrator's limited perception of the world. At the beginning of the story, the narrator equates blindness with helplessness and diminished existence. He reveals his deep-seated prejudices early on. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to, he says. His dismissive tone and discomfort suggests his inability to comprehend a life outside of his own narrow worldview. He further reveals his misconceptions about blind people when he says, "My idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed." This statement highlights how the narrator relies on superficial representations rather than genuine understanding. His perspective is not just uninformed, it is emblematic of his own spiritual and emotional blindness. However, Robert's presence challenges these assumptions. Despite being physically blind, Robert demonstrates a deeper awareness of the world than the narrator, engaging in rich conversations, maintaining emotional connections, and even expressing interest in activities like drawing. In contrast, the narrator, who has physical sight, struggles to see beyond his immediate surroundings and experiences. The climactic moment of the story in which Robert asks the narrator to draw a cathedral represents the narrator's first experience of seeing beyond the literal. As he draws with his eyes closed, he remarks, quote, "My eyes were still closed. I was in my house, I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything." This moment signifies the narrator's breakthrough. He finally understands that true vision is not dependent on physical sight, but on perspective and experience. His blindness in this moment is paradoxically what allows him to see for the first time. And overall, this theme is central to Carver's broader exploration of emotional stagnation and the limitation of perception. The narrator's transformation suggests that blindness, rather than being physical limitation, is often self-imposed, at least in this kind of metaphorical sense. Through his interaction with Robert, he learns that true understanding requires active engagement rather than passive observation. Another key theme in Cathedral is that of isolation and emotional disconnection, right? So isolation both physically and emotionally. At the start of the story, the narrator is detached from both his wife and the world around him. His lack of emotional engagement is evident in the way he describes his wife's past unalive herself attempt with stark indifference. Quote, "She went in and swallowed all the pills and capsules in the medicine cabinet and washed them down with a bottle of gin." His tone when discussing this very traumatic event where his wife tried to unalive herself is clinical. It's devoid of empathy or deeper reflection. This lack of connection extends to his marriage, where he and his wife live together but seem emotionally separate. He notes, quote, "We lived in a house that had a living room, a kitchen, a hallway, a bath, and 2 bedrooms. At that moment, one of the bedrooms, the one my wife slept in, was being used as a storage room." The fact that his wife's bedroom has been turned into a storage space serves as a powerful symbol of emotional detachment. It suggests that even within the same house, they are leading separate, disconnected lives. So in terms of another key theme, Robert, in contrast, represents connection and emotional openness. Unlike the narrator who struggles to communicate, Robert's cultivated a deep emotional bond with the narrator's wife, despite never having physically seen her. The narrator, recognizing this bond, responds with jealousy and resentment rather than understanding. However, as the evening progresses, Robert begins breaking through the narrator's emotional walls when they start drawing together. A rare moment of intimacy occurs. Quote, "His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. It was like nothing else in my life up to now." This moment, marked by physical closeness and cooperation, symbolizes the bridging of isolation that the narrator needed to get across. The narrator, for the first time, engages in something outside of himself, illustrating Carver's belief in the transformative power of human connection. Another recurring theme in Cathedral is the inadequacy of language as a mean of true understanding. The narrator struggles to articulate his thoughts, relying on sarcasm and cynicism rather than meaningful conversation. His lack of communication with his wife is evident when he dismisses her poetry and her emotional depth and her feelings. This theme reaches its peak when Robert asks the narrator to describe a cathedral. "I stared hard at the shot of the cathedral on the TV. How could I even begin to describe it?" The narrator's failure to put the image into words reflects his inability to express deeper emotions. He can see the cathedral, yet he cannot communicate its essence, just as he has failed to connect emotionally with his wife. He has trouble bridging those distances. So Robert's response is significant in this sense, highlighting the theme of overcoming the limits of language. Rather than pressing the narrator for a verbal description, he suggests drawing. Quote, "Close your eyes now," the blind man said to me. This moment underscores the story's central idea that true understanding is not always verbal. Sometimes it must be experienced. This drawing exercise allows the narrator to engage in a new form of communication, one that transcends words and taps into something deeper. So let's talk about some scholarly perspectives on Cathedral and its theme. So Kirk Nesset, who we talked about before, discusses the concept of emotional blindness, stating, quote, "Carver's characters often exist in a state of emotional paralysis, unable to express or comprehend their own desires and fears. The narrator's transformation in Cathedral marks one of Carver's rare moments of redemption." This quote supports the idea that Cathedral is unique among Carver's work. While many of his stories end in unresolved tension, this one offers a moment of transcendence. Arthur M. Saltzman, who we've also talked about, also notes, quote, "The narrator begins his story not only blind to Robert's humanity, but blind to his own limitations. His ultimate revelation is not about sight, but about perception, the ability to engage with the world beyond the surface level." Saltzman's analysis here reinforces the idea that the narrator's journey is not about physical vision, but about seeing in a deeper, more meaningful way. Raymond Carver himself, in discussing Cathedral, reflected on its message of transformation. Quote, "I wanted to show a character who has a breakthrough, no matter how small. Even the slightest moment of change can be profound." This insight confirms that the narrator's transformation, though subtle, is significant in Carver's literary vision. And so, through its exploration of blindness, isolation, communication, and transformation, Cathedral presents a powerful meditation on human connection. The narrator, initially trapped in ignorance and detachment, experiences a moment of true perception by engaging with Robert. By the end of the story, he has not only learned to see differently, he has felt something new, marking the beginning of real change, again highlighting his final words in this context, quote, "It's really something," which suggests that while he may not fully understand what has happened, he recognizes the event's profound significance. Now, here we are at our audiobook portion of the video for a reading of Cathedral by Raymond Carver. This blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on his way to spend the night. His wife had died, so he was visiting the dead wife's relatives in Connecticut. He called my wife from his in-laws. Arrangements were made. He would come by train, a 5-hour trip, and my wife would meet him at the station. She hadn't seen him since she worked for him one summer in Seattle 10 years ago, but she and the blind man had kept in touch. They made tapes and mailed them back and forth. I wasn't enthusiastic about his visit. He was no one I knew, and his being blind bothered me. My idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed. Sometimes they were led by seeing eye dogs. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to. That summer in Seattle, she had needed a job. She didn't have any money. The man she was going to marry at the end of the summer was in officer's training school. He didn't have any money either. But she was in love with the guy, and he was in love with her, etc. She'd seen something in the paper, help wanted, reading to a blind man, and a telephone number. She phoned and went over, was hired on the spot. She worked with this blind man all summer. She read stuff to him, case studies, reports, that sort of thing. She helped him organize his little office in the county social service department. They'd become good friends, my wife and the blind man. On her last day in the office, the blind man asked if he could touch her face. She agreed to this. She told me he'd touched his fingers to every part of her face, her nose, even her neck. She never forgot it. She even tried to write a poem about it. She was always trying to write a poem. She wrote a poem or two every year, usually after something really important had happened to her. When we first started going out together, she showed me the poem. In the poem, she recalled his fingers and the way they had moved around over her face. In the poem, she talked about what she had felt at the time, about what went through her mind when the blind man touched her nose and lips. I can remember I didn't think much of the poem. Of course, I didn't tell her that. Maybe I just don't understand poetry. I admit it's not the first thing I reach for when I pick up something to read. Anyway, this man who'd first enjoyed her favors, this officer-to-be, he'd been her childhood sweetheart. So, okay. I'm saying at the end of the summer, she let the blind man run his hands over her face, said goodbye to him, married her childhood etc., who was now a commissioned officer, and she moved away from Seattle. But they'd keep in touch, she and the blind man. She'd made the first contact after a year or so. She called him one night from an Air Force base in Alabama. She wanted to talk. They talked. He asked her to send him a tape and tell him about her life. She did this. She sent the tape. On the tape, she told the blind man she loved her husband, but she didn't like it where they lived, and she didn't like that he was a part of the military-industrial thing. She told the blind man she'd written a poem, and he was in it. She told him that she was writing a poem about what it was like to be an Air Force officer's wife. The poem wasn't finished yet. She was still writing it. The blind man made a tape. He sent her the tape. She made a tape. This went on for years. My wife's officer was posted to one base, and then another. She sent tapes from Moody AFB, McGuire, McConnell, and finally Travis near Sacramento, where one night she got to feeling lonely and cut off from people she kept losing in that moving around life. She got to feeling she couldn't go it another step. She went in and swallowed all the pills and capsules in the medicine chest and washed them down with a bottle of gin. Then she got into a hot bath and passed out. But instead of dying, she got sick. She threw up. Her officer, why should he have a name? He was a childhood sweetheart, and what more does he want? Came home from somewhere, found her, and called the ambulance. In time, she put it all on the tape and sent the tape to the blind man. Over the years, she put all kinds of stuff on tapes and sent the tapes off lickety-split. Next to writing a poem every year, I think it was her chief means of recreation. On one tape, she told the blind man she decided to live away from her officer for a time. On another tape, she told him about her divorce. She and I began going out, and of course she told her blind man about it. She told him everything, or so it seemed to me. Once she asked me if I'd like to hear the latest tape from the blind man. This was a year ago. I was on the tape, she said. So I said okay. I'd listen to it. I got us drinks, and we settled down in the living room. We made ready to listen. First she inserted the tape into the player and adjusted a couple of dials. Then she pushed a lever. The tape squeaked and someone began to talk in this loud voice. She lowered the volume. After a few minutes of harmless chit-chat, I heard my own name in the mouth of this stranger, this blind man I didn't even know. And then this. From all you've said about him, I can only conclude. But we were interrupted. A knock at the door, something, and we didn't ever get back to the tape. Maybe it was just as well. I'd heard all I wanted to. Now, this same blind man was coming over to sleep in my house. Maybe I could take him bowling, I said to my wife. She was at the draining board doing scalloped potatoes. She put down the knife she was using and turned around. "If you love me," she said, "you can do this for me. If you don't love me, okay. But if you had a friend, any friend, and the friend came to visit, I'd make him feel comfortable." She wiped her hands with a dish towel. "I don't have any blind friends," I said. "You don't have any friends," she said. "Period. Besides," she said, "God damn it, his wife just died. Don't you understand that? The man's lost his wife." I didn't answer. She'd told me a little about the blind man's wife. Her name was Beulah. Beulah? That's a name for a colored woman. Was his wife a Negro? I asked. "Are you crazy?" my wife said. "Have you just flipped or something?" She picked up a potato. I saw it hit the floor, then roll under the stove. "What's wrong with you?" she said. "Are you drunk?" "I'm just asking," I said. Right then, my wife filled me in with more detail than I cared to know. I made a drink and sat at the kitchen table to listen. Pieces of the story began to fall into place. Beulah had gone to work for the blind man the summer after my wife had stopped working for him. Pretty soon, Beulah and the blind man had themselves a church wedding. It was a little wedding. Who'd want to go to such a wedding in the first place? Just the two of them plus a minister and the minister's wife. But it was a church wedding just the same. It was what Beulah had wanted, he'd said. But even then, Beulah must have been carrying the cancer in her glands. After they'd been inseparable for 8 years, my wife's word, inseparable, Beulah's health went into a rapid decline. She died in a Seattle hospital room, the blind man sitting beside the bed and holding onto her hand. They'd married, lived, and worked together, slept together, had sex, sure, and then the blind man had to bury her. All this without his having ever seen what the goddamn woman looked like. It was beyond my understanding. Hearing this, I felt sorry for the blind man for a little bit. And then I found myself thinking what a pitiful life this woman must have led. Imagine, a woman who could never see herself as she was seen in the eyes of her loved one. A woman who could go on day after day and never receive the smallest compliment from her beloved. A woman whose husband could never read the expression on her face, be it misery or something better. Someone who could wear makeup or not. What difference to him? She could, if she wanted, wear green eyeshadow around one eye, a straight pin in her nostril, yellow slacks, and purple shoes. No matter. And then to slip off into death. The blind man's hand on her hand, his blind eyes streaming tears. I'm imagining now. Her last thought may be this, that he never even knew what she looked like, and she on an express to the grave. Robert was left with a small insurance policy and half of a 20 peso Mexican coin. The other half of the coin went into the box with her. Pathetic. So when the time rolled around, my wife went to the depot to pick him up. With nothing to do but wait. Sure, I blamed him for that. I was having a drink and watching the TV when I heard the car pull into the drive. I got up from the sofa with my drink and went to the window to have a look. I saw my wife laughing as she parked the car. I saw her get out of the car and shut the door. She was still wearing a smile. Just amazing. She went around to the other side of the car to where the blind man was already starting to get out. This blind man, feature this, he was wearing a full beard. A beard on a blind man. Too much, I say. The blind man reached into the back seat and dragged out a suitcase. My wife took his arm, shut the car door, and, talking all the way, moved him down the drive and then up the steps to the front porch. I turned off the TV. I finished my drink, rinsed the glass, dried my hands. Then I went to the door. My wife said, "I want you to meet Robert. Robert, this is my husband. I've told you all about him." She was beaming. She had this blind man by his coat sleeve. The blind man let go of his suitcase and up came his hand. I took it. He squeezed hard, held my hand, and then he let it go. "I feel like we've already met," he boomed. "Likewise," I said. I didn't know what else to say. Then I said, "Welcome, I've heard a lot about you." We began to move then, a little group, from the porch into the living room, my wife guiding him by the arm. The blind man was carrying his suitcase in his other hand. My wife said things like, "To your left here, Robert. That's right. Now watch it, there's a chair. That's it, sit down right here. This is a sofa. We just bought this sofa 2 weeks ago." I started to say something about the old sofa. I'd like that old sofa, but I didn't say anything. Then I wanted to say something else. Small talk about the scenic ride along the Hudson. How, going to New York, you should sit on the right-hand side of the train, and coming from New York, the left-hand side. "Did you have a good train ride?" I said. "Which side of the train did you sit on, by the way?" "What a question, which side?" my wife said. "What's the matter, which side?" she said. "I just asked," I said. "Right side," the blind man said. "I hadn't been on a train in nearly 40 years, not since I was a kid, with my folks. That's been a long time. I'd nearly forgotten the sensation. I have winter in my beard now," he said. "So I've been told, anyway. Do I look distinguished, my dear?" the blind man said to my wife. "You look distinguished, Robert," she said. "Robert," she said. "Robert, it's just so good to see you." My wife finally took her eyes off the blind man and looked at me. I had the feeling she didn't like what she saw. I shrugged. I've never met or personally known anybody who was blind. This blind man was late 40s, a heavy-set, balding man with stooped shoulders, as if he carried a great weight there. He wore brown slacks, brown shoes, a light brown shirt, a tie, a sports coat. Spiffy. He also had this full beard, but he didn't use a cane, and he didn't wear dark glasses. I'd always thought dark glasses were a must for the blind. Fact was, I wish he had a pair. At first glance, his eyes looked like anyone else's, but if you look close, there was something different about them. Too much white in the iris, for one thing, and the pupils seemed to move around in the sockets without his knowing it or being able to stop it. Creepy. As I stared at his face, I saw the left pupil turn in toward his nose, while the other made an effort to keep in one place. But it was only an effort, for that one eye was on the roam without his knowing it or wanting it to be. I said, "Let me get you a drink. What's your pleasure? We have a little bit of everything. It's one of our pastimes." "Bub, I'm a Scotchman myself," he said fast enough in his big voice. "Right," I said. "Bub." "Sure you are. I knew it." He let his fingers touch this suitcase, which was sitting alongside the sofa. He was taking his bearings. I didn't blame him for that. "I'll move that up to your room," my wife said. "No, that's fine," the blind man said loudly. "It can go up when I go up." "A little water with the scotch?" I said. "Very little," he said. "I knew it," I said. He said, "Just a tad. The Irish actor, Barry Fitzgerald? I'm like that fellow. When I drink water," Fitzgerald said, "I drink water. When I drink whiskey, I drink whiskey." My wife laughed. The blind man brought his hand up under his beard. He lifted his beard slowly and let it drop. I did the drinks, 3 big glasses of scotch with a splash of water in each. Then we made ourselves comfortable and talked about Robert's travels. First a long flight from the west coast to Connecticut. We covered that. Then from Connecticut up here by train. We had another drink considering that leg of the trip. I remembered having read somewhere that the blind didn't smoke because, as speculation had it, they couldn't see the smoke they exhaled. I thought I knew that much and that much only about blind people. But this blind man smoked his cigarette down to the nubbin and then lit another one. This blind man filled his ashtray and my wife emptied it. When we sat down at the table for dinner, we had another drink. My wife heaped Robert's plate with cube steak, scalloped potatoes, green beans. I buttered him up 2 slices of bread. I said, "Here's bread and butter for you." I swallowed some of my drink. "Now let us pray," I said, and the blind man lowered his head. My wife looked at me, her mouth agape. "Pray the phone won't ring and the food doesn't get cold," I said. We dug in. We ate everything there was to eat on the table. We ate like there was no tomorrow. We didn't talk. We ate. We scarfed. We grazed the table. We were into serious eating. This blind man had right away located his foods. He knew just where everything was on his plate. I watched with admiration as he used his knife and fork on the meat. He'd cut 2 pieces of the meat, fork the meat into his mouth, and then go all out for the scalloped potatoes, the beans next, and then he'd tear off a hunk of buttered bread and eat that. He'd follow this up with a big drink of milk. It didn't seem to bother him to use his fingers once in a while either. We finished everything, including half a strawberry pie. For a few moments, we sat as if stunned. Sweat beaded on our faces. Finally, we got up from the table and left the dirty plates. We didn't look back. We took ourselves into the living room and sank into our places again. Robert and my wife sat on the sofa. I took the big chair. We had us 2 or 3 more drinks while they talked about the major things that had come to pass for them in the past 10 years. For the most part, I just listened. Now and then I joined in. I didn't want him to think I'd left the room, and I didn't want her to think I was feeling left out. They talked of things that had happened to them. To them! These past 10 years. I waited in vain to hear my name on my wife's sweet lips. And then my dear husband came into my life. Something like that. But I heard nothing of the sort. More talk of Robert. Robert had done a little of everything, it seemed. A regular blind jack of all trades. But most recently, he and his wife had had an away distributorship, from which, I gathered, they'd earned a living, such as it was. The blind man was also a ham radio operator. He talked in his loud voice about conversations he'd had with fellow operators in Guam, in the Philippines, in Alaska, and even in Tahiti. He said he'd have a lot of friends there if she ever wanted to go visit those places. From time to time, he'd turn his blind face toward me, put his hand under his beard, ask me something. How long had I been in my present position? 3 years. Did I like my work? I didn't. Was I going to stay with it? What were the options? Finally, when I thought he was beginning to run down, I got up and turned on the TV. My wife looked at me with irritation. She was heading towards a boil. Then she looked at the blind man and said, "Robert, do you have a TV?" The blind man said, "My dear, I have 2 TVs. I have a color set and a black and white thing, an old relic. It's funny, but if I turn the TV on, and I'm always turning it on, I turn it on the color set. It's funny, don't you think?" I didn't know what to say to that.
I had absolutely nothing to say to that. No opinion. So I watched the news program and tried to listen to what the announcer was saying. "This is a color TV," the blind man said. "Don't ask me how, but I can tell." "We traded up a while ago," I said. The blind man had another taste of his drink. He lifted his beard, sniffed it, and let it fall. He leaned forward on the sofa. He positioned his ashtray on the coffee table, then put the lighter to a cigarette. He leaned back on the sofa and crossed his legs at the ankles. My wife covered her mouth, and then she yawned. She stretched. She said, "I think I'll go upstairs and put on my robe. I think I'll change into something else. Robert, you make yourself comfortable," she said. "I'm comfortable," the blind man said. "I want you to feel comfortable in this house," she said. "I am comfortable," the blind man said. After she'd left the room, he and I listened to the weather report, and then to the sports roundup. By that time, she'd been gone so long I didn't know if she was going to come back. I thought she might have gone to bed. I wish she'd come back downstairs. I didn't want to be left alone with a blind man. I asked him if he wanted another drink, and he said sure. Then I asked if he wanted to smoke some dope with me. I said I'd just rolled a number. I hadn't, but I planned to do so in about 2 shakes. "I'll try some with you," he said. "Damn right," I said. "That's the stuff." I got our drinks and sat down on the sofa with him. Then I rolled us 2 fat numbers. I lit one and passed it. I brought it to his fingers. He took it and inhaled. "Hold it as long as you can," I said. I could tell he didn't know the first thing. My wife came back downstairs, wearing her pink robe and her pink slippers. "What do I smell?" she said. "We thought we'd have us some cannabis," I said. My wife gave me a savage look. Then she looked at the blind man and said, "Robert, I didn't know you smoked." He said, "I do now, my dear. There's a first time for everything, but I don't feel anything yet." "This stuff is pretty mellow," I said. "This stuff is mild. It's dope you can reason with," I said. "It doesn't mess you up." "Not much it doesn't, bub," he said and laughed. My wife sat on the sofa between the blind man and me. I passed her the number. She took it and toked and then passed it back to me. "Which way is this going?" she said. Then she said, "I shouldn't be smoking this. I can hardly keep my eyes open as it is. That dinner did me in. I shouldn't have eaten so much." "It was a strawberry pie," the blind man said. "That's what did it," he said, and he laughed his big laugh. Then he shook his head. "There's more strawberry pie," I said. "Do you want some more, Robert?" my wife said. "Maybe in a little while," he said. We gave our attention to the TV. My wife yawned again. She said, "Your bed is made up when you feel like going to bed, Robert. I know you must have had a long day. When you're ready to go to bed, say so." She pulled his arm. "Robert?" He came to and said, "I've had a real nice time. This beats tapes, doesn't it?" I said, "Coming at ya," and I put the number between his fingers. He inhaled, held the smoke, and then let it go. It was like he'd been doing this since he was 9 years old. "Thanks, bub," he said. "But I think this is all for me. I think I'm beginning to feel it," he said. He held the burning roach out for my wife. "Same here," she said. "Ditto. Me too." She took the roach and passed it to me. "I may just sit here for a while between you 2 guys with my eyes closed, but don't let me bother you, okay? Either one of you. If it bothers you, say so. Otherwise, I may just sit here with my eyes closed until you're ready to go to bed," she said. "Your bed's made up, Robert, when you're ready. It's right next to our room at the top of the stairs. We'll show you up when you're ready. You wake me up now, you guys, if I fall asleep." She said that, and then she closed her eyes and went to sleep. The news program ended. I got up and changed the channel. I sat back down on the sofa. I wish my wife hadn't pooped out. Her head lay across the back of the sofa, her mouth open. She'd turned so that the robe had slipped away from her legs, exposing a juicy thigh. I reached to draw her robe back over her, and it was then that I glanced at the blind man. What the hell? I flipped the robe again. "You say when you want some strawberry pie," I said. "I will," he said. I said, "Are you tired? Do you want me to take you up to your bed? Are you ready to hit the hay?" "Not yet," he said. "No, I'll just stay up with you, bub, if that's all right. I'll stay up until you're ready to turn in. We haven't had the chance to talk. Know what I mean? I feel like me and her monopolized the evening." He lifted his beard and he let it fall. He picked up his cigarettes and his lighter. "That's all right," I said. Then I said, "I'm glad for the company." And I guess I was. Every night I smoked dope and stayed up as long as I could before I fell asleep. My wife and I hardly ever went to bed at the same time. When I did go to sleep, I had these dreams. Sometimes I'd wake up from one of them, my heart going crazy. Something about the church in the Middle Ages was on the TV. Not your run-of-the-mill TV fare. I wanted to watch something else. I turned to the other channels, but there was nothing on them either. So I turned back to the first channel and apologized. "Bub, it's all right," the blind man said. "It's fine with me. Whatever you want to watch is okay. I'm always learning something. Learning never ends. It won't hurt me to learn something tonight. I got ears," he said. We didn't say anything for a time. He was leaning forward with his head turned at me, his right ear aimed in the direction of the set. Very disconcerting. Now and then his eyelids dropped and then they snapped open again. Now and then he put his fingers into his beard and tugged, like he was thinking about something he was hearing on the television. On the screen, a group of men wearing cows was being set upon and tormented by men dressed in skeleton costumes and men dressed as devils. The men dressed as devils wore devil masks, horns, and long tails. This pageant was part of a procession. The Englishman who was narrating the thing said it took place in Spain once a year. I tried to explain to the blind man what was happening. "Skeletons," he said. "I know about skeletons," he said, and he nodded. The TV showed this one cathedral. Then there was a long, slow look at another one. Finally, the picture switched to the famous one in Paris, with its flying buttresses and its spires reaching up to the clouds. The camera pulled away to show the whole of the cathedral rising above the skyline. There were times when the Englishman who was telling the thing would shut up, would simply let the camera move around over the cathedrals, or else the camera would tour the countryside, men in fields walking behind oxen. I waited as long as I could, then I felt I had to say something. I said, "They're showing the outside of this cathedral now. Gargoyles, little statues carved to look like monsters. Now I guess they're in Italy." "Yeah, they're in Italy. There's paintings on the walls of this one church." "Are those fresco paintings, bub?" he asked, and he sipped from his drink. I reached for my glass, but it was empty. I tried to remember what I could remember. "You're asking me, are those frescoes?" I said. "That's a good question. I don't know." The camera moved to a cathedral outside Lisbon. The difference in the Portuguese cathedral compared with the French and Italian were not that great, but they were there. Mostly the interior stuff. Then something occurred to me, and I said, "Something has occurred to me. Do you have any idea what a cathedral is? What they look like, that is. Do you follow me? If somebody says cathedral to you, do you have any notion what they're talking about? Do you know the difference between that and a Baptist church, say?" He let the smoke dribble from his mouth. "I know they took hundreds of workers 50 or 100 years to build," he said. "I just heard the man say that, of course. I know generations of the same families worked on a cathedral. I heard him say that too. The men who began their life's work on them, they never lived to see the completion of their work. In that way, bub, they're no different from the rest of us, right?" He laughed. Then his eyelids drooped again. His head nodded. He seemed to be snoozing. Maybe he was imagining himself in Portugal. The TV was showing another cathedral now. The Englishman's voice droned on. "Cathedrals," the blind man said. He sat up and rolled his head back and forth. "If you want the truth, bub, that's about all I know. What I just said. What I heard him say. But maybe you could describe one to me. I wish you'd do it. I'd like that. If you want to know, I really don't have a good idea." I stared hard at the shot of the cathedral on the TV. How could I even begin to describe it? But say my life depended on it. Say my life was being threatened by an insane guy who said I had to do it, or else. I stared some more at the cathedral before the picture flipped off into the countryside. There was no use. I turned to the blind man and said, "To begin with, they're very tall." I was looking around the room for clues. They reach way up and up, toward the sky. They're so big, some of them, they have to have these supports to help hold them up, so to speak. These supports are called buttresses. They remind me of viaducts for some reason. But maybe you don't know viaducts either. Sometimes the cathedrals have devils and such carved into the front. Sometimes lords and ladies. Don't ask me why this is, I said. He was nodding. The whole upper part of his body seemed to be moving back and forth. "I'm not doing so good, am I?" I said. He stopped nodding and leaned forward on the edge of the sofa. As he listened to me, he was running his fingers through his beard. I wasn't getting through to him. I could see that. But he waited for me to go on just the same. He nodded, like he was trying to encourage me. I tried to think what else to say. "They're really big," I said. "They're massive. They're built of stone. Marble, too, sometimes. In those olden days, when they built cathedrals, men wanted to be close to God. In those olden days, God was an important part of everyone's life. You could tell this from their cathedral building." "I'm sorry," I said, "but it looks like that's the best I can do for you. I'm just no good at it." "That's all right, bub," the blind man said. "Hey, listen, I hope you don't mind my asking you. Can I ask you something? Let me ask you a simple question, yes or no. I'm just curious and there's no offense. You're my host. But let me ask you if you are in any way religious. You don't mind my asking?" I shook my head. He couldn't see that, though. A wink is the same as a nod to a blind man. "I guess I don't believe in it. In anything. Sometimes it's hard. You know what I'm saying?" "Sure I do," he said. "Right," I said. The Englishman was still holding forth. My wife sighed in her sleep. She drew a long breath and went on with her sleeping. "You'll have to forgive me," I said, "but I can't tell you what a cathedral looks like. It just isn't in me to do it. I can't do any more than I've done." The blind man sat very still, his head down as he listened to me. I said, "The truth is, cathedrals don't mean anything special to me. Nothing. Cathedrals. They're something to look at on late-night TV. That's all they are." It was then that the blind man cleared his throat. He brought something up. He took a handkerchief from his back pocket. Then he said, "I get it, bub. It's okay. It happens. Don't worry about it," he said. "Hey, listen to me. Will you do me a favor? I got an idea. Why don't you find us some heavy paper and a pen? We'll do something. We'll draw one together. Get us a pen and some heavy paper. Go on, bub. Get the stuff," he said. So I went upstairs. My legs felt like they didn't have any strength in them. They felt like they did after I'd done some running. In my wife's room, I looked around. I found some ballpoints in a little basket on her table. And then I tried to think where to look for the kind of paper he was talking about. Downstairs in the kitchen, I found a shopping bag with onion skins in the bottom of the bag. I emptied the bag and shook it. I brought it into the living room and sat down with it near his legs. I moved some things, smoothed the wrinkles from the bag, spread it out on the coffee table. The blind man got down from the sofa and sat next to me on the carpet. He ran his fingers over the paper. He went up and down the sides of the paper, the edges, even the edges. He fingered the corners. "All right," he said. "All right, let's do her." He found my hand, the hand with the pen. He closed his hand over my hand. "Go ahead, bub. Draw," he said. "Draw, you'll see. I'll follow along with you. It'll be okay. Just begin now, like I'm telling you. You'll see. Draw," the blind man said. So I began. First I drew a box that looked like a house. It could have been the house I lived in. Then I put a roof on it. At either end of the roof, I drew spires. Crazy. Swell, he said. Terrific, you're doing fine, he said. Never thought anything like this could happen in your lifetime, did you, bub? Well, it's a strange life. We all know that. Go on now. Keep it up. I put in windows with arches. I drew flying buttresses. I hung great doors. I couldn't stop. The TV station went off the air. I put down the pen and closed and opened my fingers. The blind man felt around over the paper. He moved the tips of his fingers over the paper, all over what I had drawn, and he nodded. Doing fine, the blind man said. I took up the pen again, and he found my hand. I kept at it. I'm no artist, but I kept drawing just the same. My wife opened her eyes and gazed at us. She sat up on the sofa, her robe hanging open. She said, "What are you doing? Tell me, I want to know." I didn't answer her. The blind man said, "We're drawing a cathedral. Me and him are working on it. Press hard," he said to me. "That's right, that's good," he said. "Sure, you got it, bub. I can tell. You didn't think you could, but you can, can't you? You're cooking with gas now. You know what I'm saying? We're gonna really have us something here in a minute. How's the old arm?" he said. "Put some people in there now. What's a cathedral without people?" My wife said, "What's going on? Robert, what are you doing? What's going on?" "It's all right," he said to her. "Close your eyes now," the blind man said to me. I did it. I closed them just like he said. "Are they closed?" he said. "Don't fudge." "They're closed," I said. "Keep them that way," he said. He said, "Don't stop now. Draw." So we kept on with it. His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. It was like nothing else in my life up to now. Then he said, "I think that's it. I think you got it," he said. "Take a look. What do you think?" But I had my eyes closed. I thought I'd keep them that way for a little longer. I thought it was something I ought to do. "Well," he said, "are you looking?" My eyes were still closed. I was in my house. I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything. "It's really something," I said.
So now that we've read the story and we summarized it and we analyzed it, let's talk about how Cathedral fits into the broader works of Raymond Carver. So Raymond Carver's Cathedral is often considered a pivotal work in his literary career, marking a departure from the bleak minimalism of his earlier stories towards a more expansive and redemptive vision of human connection. Scholars argue that while Cathedral retains Carver's signature themes, emotional isolation, communication struggles, and working class life, it also introduces a rare moment of transformation and hope, setting it apart from much of his previous work. So looking at these broader categories of how it fits into his work, let's talk about that shift from early Carver to later Carver. Carver's early works, particularly in Will You Please Be Quiet, Please, in 1976, and What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, 1981, are often characterized by minimalism, emotional paralysis, and unresolved tension. These stories in these collections, heavily edited under the influence of his editor Gordon Lish, leave characters trapped in states of disconnection. However, Cathedral, written 1983, represents a shift. It is still minimalist, but the story allows for characters' transformation, a rarity in Carver's fiction up to that point. Carver on his own evolution in this sense, Carver himself acknowledged this shift, stating, quote, "In my earlier stories, I was interested in the hard edges of things, but I began to feel that my characters deserved a little more generosity." This insight from Carver suggests that Cathedral was part of his conscious effort to move beyond the bleak fatalism of his earlier fiction. Similarly, in an interview with the Paris Review, Carver reflected, "I wanted to move away from stories where nothing changes. I wanted to see if a character could have a small moment of insight or revelation." The narrator's transformation in Cathedral from detached and cynical to open and engaged embodies this shift. So Many critics, too, have placed Carver within the school of this genre called dirty realism, or another term for it is quote-unquote Kmart realism, a term coined by critic Madison Smart Bell to describe literature that focuses on working-class life in stark, unembellished prose. Carver's earlier stories fit neatly into this category, portraying failed relationships, economic hardship, and emotional stagnation. However, Cathedral complicates this classification by introducing a moment of transcendence. Rather than leaving the narrator stuck in his emotional blindness, Carver offers a glimpse of change. In terms of another voice on this perspective of shifting styles and how it fits into his broader work, Kirk Nesset argues, quote, "If Carver's early stories trap the characters in moments of despair, Cathedral introduces a possibility of escape. The narrator is still flawed, but his moment of revelation, however slight, suggests a movement toward something greater." This quote from Nesset aligns with Carver's own shift in thinking about storytelling, in which he began to explore possibilities for growth rather than mere stagnation. Another key factor to consider in how this fits in with Carver's larger works is that Carver's early works often depict characters struggling with alcoholism, reflecting his own battles with addiction. In fact, many of his early protagonists are emotionally numb, distant, or outright destructive, hallmarks of his own life before he achieved sobriety in 1977. So Carver openly acknowledged the role of alcoholism in shaping his characters, quote, "I couldn't have written Cathedral when I was drinking. My characters back then were trapped, just like I was. But I was in a different place when I wrote this story." This commentary from Carver suggests that Cathedral represents not just a stylistic shift, but a personal evolution for Carver himself. The narrator's transformation mirrors Carver's own emergence from addiction. Both move from detachment to a newfound awareness of life possibilities. Further on this topic of how it fits into this ideas of addiction and redemption, in Understanding Raymond Carver, Arthur M. Saltzman argues, quote, "Carver's fiction often explores the cost of addiction, not just substance abuse, but addiction to emotional withdrawal, to isolation. Cathedral is one of the few stories where a character breaks free, even if only for a moment." This quote from Saltzman aligns with Carver's trajectory. Early stories from Carver capture the damage of addiction, while later stories like Cathedral suggest the possibility of healing. So in terms of Carver's larger themes of communication and connection and how this intersects with Cathedral, this idea of communication and failure within it is a central theme throughout Carver's work, this inability to effectively communicate. Many of his early character struggles to articulate their feelings, resulting in fractured relationships and unresolved tensions. The narrator in Cathedral initially embodies this theme. He cannot express his life for his wife. He mocks Robert's blindness, and he struggles to describe a cathedral. However, the story ultimately subverts Carver's usual treatment of communication failure with a piece of successful communication, even if it is nonverbal. And let's talk about that, right? Unlike many Carver characters who remain trapped in their inability to communicate, the narrator in Cathedral finds an alternative way to connect through drawing. His transformation occurs not just through words, but through a shared physical act. Quote, "His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper." This tactile experience allows the narrator to bridge the gap between himself and another person, something rarely seen in Carver's earlier fiction. In contemporary American short story cycles, James Nagle states, quote, "Carver's work is often about people who talk, but who do not communicate, who live together, but who do not connect. Cathedral is a turning point because, for once, a character finds a way, however small, to reach beyond himself." This insight underscores why Cathedral is often seen as a counterpoint to Carver's earlier works, offering a moment of grace that is rarely afforded to his other characters. So, in many ways, Cathedral serves as a bridge between Carver's early and later works. It retains his minimalist style, but introduces a greater emotional depth. It addresses themes of isolation in communication and failure in communication, but instead of leaving them unresolved, it offers a moment of change, hope for future communication. It also reflects Carver's own transformation from addiction and despair to sobriety and newfound hope. And so while Carver's later works, particularly those in Where I'm Calling From, the short story collection from 1988, continue this trajectory, Cathedral remains one of his most hopeful and redemptive stories. As Carver himself put it, quote, "There are moments when something happens and something opens up inside a person. I wanted to capture that." And with Cathedral, he did indeed achieve that. If this video helped you, or if you enjoyed it, please like it and subscribe to my channel. It helps me to be able to keep supporting you all. If you have any requests for short stories or poetry or summaries and analyses, please let me know in the comments. And just dropping a comment to say thanks or hi also greatly helps me out. Feel free to ask me any questions related to your homework that you think I can help with. Stay lit with Simply Lit.